In the winter of 1947, at the lowest place on the surface of the earth, a teenage shepherd is looking for a goat. His name is Muhammad. His people, the Ta'amire, have grazed these cliffs above the Dead Sea for generations. The landscape here is pale limestone and absolute silence, 400 meters below the level of the ocean. The air sits heavy and still. The water below is so dense with salt that nothing lives in it. The goat has climbed somewhere it shouldn't. And as Muhammad searches along the rock face in the early morning light, he notices something he has passed 100 times without seeing. A small dark opening in the cliff. A hole, barely wide enough for a cat. He does what any shepherd in any century would do. He picks up a stone and throws it in, and out of the darkness comes a sound that is wrong. Not stone on stone, something hollow, something man-made, the sound of clay breaking. Remember that sound, pottery, shattering in the dark. Everything tonight comes out of it. This night asks nothing of you except that you follow the sound of one stone, thrown by a teenager who was looking for a goat. When he squeezes inside, some say the next day, with his cousin, he finds the floor lined with tall ceramic jars. Most are empty, but inside one of them, wrapped in linen that crumbles at the touch, are rolls of dark leather, covered edge to edge in careful lines of writing, in a language he cannot read. He has no way of knowing what he is holding. Nobody on earth does. Because what came out of that jar, and out of 10 more caves in the cliffs around it over the next 9 years, is the oldest library that has ever been returned to human hands. Some 900 manuscripts, tens of thousands of fragments, books of the Bible a full 1,000 years older than any copy anyone had ever seen, and books that nobody had seen at all, books that had been banned, books that had been lost, and one scroll that isn't leather, or papyrus, or ink, but hammered copper, and what's written on it is a list of buried treasure that has never been found. Somebody hid all of it, deliberately, carefully, wrapped in linen, sealed in jars, carried up cliff faces in the dark, by people who clearly intended to come back for it. They never came back. The library waited 19 centuries for a bored teenager with a stone. So tonight we climb the cliffs with him, slowly, cave by cave. What was actually hidden above the Dead Sea, and who hid it? What does the Copper Scrolls treasure list actually say, and why has none of it ever been found? How did the greatest manuscript discovery of all time end up, 7 years later, in the classified ads of an American newspaper under the heading Miscellaneous For Sale? And why did the people who sealed these jars in the dark never come back for them? You are in the right place for this. The hour is right. The story is slow and strange and worth the dark. Let me say something about the lowest place on earth before we go any further, because the place is not incidental to the story. It is part of the story in a way that most retellings skip over. The Dead Sea is not a sea. It is a lake, an endorheic lake, one with no outlet, sitting at the bottom of the Jordan Rift Valley. Water flows in, from the Jordan River to the north, and from smaller streams along the sides of the valley. Water evaporates, constantly, in the intense dry heat of the Judean desert. What does not evaporate stays, and what stays is the salt. Over millions of years, the salt has concentrated to the point where no vertebrate lives in the water. The edges of the lake are fringed with salt crystals that catch the light. The bottom of the lake is a layer of ancient salt hundreds of meters deep. The cliffs above the western shore rise almost vertically from the narrow strip of shore, up into the limestone massif of the Judean hills. They are white and pale grey in the midday sun, the rock fractured into layered shelves and overhangs. The caves sit in the cliff face like dark punctuation marks, some close to the shore level, some hundreds of meters up, some accessible by paths that only someone who had been climbing this rock face all their life would know to look for. The Ta'amire Bedouin are a tribe of the Judean desert. In the late 1940s they lived, as their ancestors had, in tents and temporary structures, moving their herds between grazing areas on a seasonal pattern that was itself a kind of deep knowledge of water sources, of grazing quality, of shelter from the Rift Valley wind. They were not nomadic in the romantic literary sense. They were practical people applying practical expertise to a specific landscape. They were not nomadic in the romantic literary sense. They were practical people applying practical expertise to a specific landscape. And Muhammad al-Thib was a young man of this community, learning the cliffs the way his father had learned them, and his father's father before that. The goat that led him to the cave was doing what goats do. The stone he threw was doing what teenagers do with stones, and the sound that came back, that wrong, hollow, man-made sound of breaking clay, was the beginning of the most significant manuscript discovery in the history of the modern world. Hold the number 11 caves. The one that changes everything is not the first, and it will not be found by an archaeologist. The answer to that question has waited 19 centuries. It can wait a little longer. First, let me tell you what the shepherd found. Before we go any further, let me say this. You don't need to follow every word tonight. This is a long climb through 11 caves, and you're allowed to drift in any of them. That's exactly right. The library will still be there when you come back. The cliffs don't move. And if you fall asleep somewhere in the middle of the story, you've done precisely what this hour asks of you. This is for the ones who love libraries. For anyone who has ever stood in front of a very old book and felt, without being able to explain why, that something important was being said across a very great distance. For the quiet ones, the ones who have always suspected that the most interesting parts of history are the parts that almost didn't survive. If any of that sounds like you, you're in exactly the right place. Settle in. Let your body be heavier than it was a moment ago. One question, before we climb. Where in the world are you tonight? And what hour is it where you are? Someone is listening to this from a city I've never been to, at a time I couldn't guess. Leave it below. I read every single one, in the mornings, with something hot. And if this kind of night is what you come here for, a quiet tap on like and a subscribe is all it takes. That's it. The rest of tonight is yours. Let me start with the geography, because the geography explains everything. The Dead Sea sits at the bottom of a geological scar, the Great Rift Valley, which runs from Turkey all the way down to Mozambique. The Dead Sea is the deepest point of the lowest piece of exposed land on Earth. Where you're sitting right now, however high up or far inland, sea level outside your window is 430 meters above the surface of the Dead Sea. The water is so laden with salt, about 10 times saltier than the ocean, that no fish live in it, no river reeds grow at its edges, and a human body floats in it without trying. Nothing rots here easily. The air is extremely dry. The limestone cliffs hold a near constant temperature. It is, almost accidentally, one of the best places on Earth for storing organic material across very long periods of time. The cliffs above the western shore are riddled with caves. Natural caves, cut by ancient water, then dried by the same forces that turned the basin into the Dead Sea. Some of them are barely crevices. Some go back 50 meters into the rock. The Bedouin of the Ta'amira tribe knew these cliffs the way they knew the lines of their own hands. They had used the caves for shelter, for storage, for hiding goods. When Muhammad al-Thib threw his stone into the hole in the winter of 1946 or 1947, the exact date is uncertain, he was doing something entirely routine in a routine landscape. The sound of breaking pottery was not routine. Inside what would later be designated Cave 1, the Shepherd's Cave, there were 10 tall ceramic jars, lids intact on most of them. The jars were cylindrical, about 60 centimeters tall, made of cream-colored clay fired to a particular hardness. 7 of the jars were empty. 3 were not. Inside the 3, wrapped in linen that had stiffened over 19 centuries into something like parchment in its own right, were 7 complete leather scrolls. 7 scrolls from the first cave alone. Muhammad and his cousin took them down from the cliffs and back to camp. Nobody in camp could read them. They were in Hebrew and Aramaic, languages that had not been the daily spoken tongue of the region for well over 1,000 years. The scrolls sat in camp, then moved, then found their way. The way that local objects in troubled territories so often do, into the hands of a merchant. His name was Khalil Eskander Shahin. He was known as Kando, and he ran a cobbler's shop in Bethlehem. Remember the cobbler's shop in Bethlehem? We are not finished with that floor. Kando recognized that he was holding something old. He passed word to the Syrian Orthodox monastery of St. Mark in Jerusalem, whose metropolitan bishop, Mar Samuel, collected antiquities. He passed word, through a different channel, to Eleazar Sukenik, an archaeologist at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Sukenik had spent his career studying ancient Jewish inscriptions. When he first held one of the scrolls, his instincts told him he was looking at something from the era of the Second Temple. If you pressed your hand to the limestone of those cliffs, the rock would feel cool even on a warm day. The caves maintain a temperature that is almost constant year-round, independent of the desert heat outside. The date was November 1947. The United Nations had just voted to partition Palestine. The city of Jerusalem was in the process of coming apart, and in the middle of that, 2 separate buyers were acquiring scrolls from the same Bedouin find without knowing about each other. Mar Samuel bought 4 scrolls. Sukenik bought 3. The world had just been handed half a library in 2 separate transactions on opposite sides of a war. Sukenik knew what he had. He knew it from the script, the specific shape of the Hebrew letters, a style he recognized from inscribed ossuaries, bone boxes of the 1st century. He told his diary, on the night he first held a scroll, that he believed he was looking at the most important Hebrew manuscript discovery ever made. He was, if anything, understating it. Mar Samuel was right to hold on to his 4. He contacted the American Schools of Oriental Research in Jerusalem, and a young scholar there named John Trevor did something that turned out to be crucial. He photographed the scrolls before the fighting made them impossible to move safely. He sent the photographs to William Foxwell Albright, one of the most eminent biblical archaeologists in the world, at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. Albright cabled back within days. His cable called the find the greatest manuscript discovery of modern times. He said it was, in his own words, the happiest day of my life, a phrase from a telegram that is still quoted in every serious account of the discovery. That cable was sent in February 1948. By May, the State of Israel had been declared. The First Arab-Israeli War had begun in full, and Mar Samuel's 4 scrolls, Sukenik's 3 already being safely held at the Hebrew University, were no longer safe in Jerusalem. Mar Samuel took his 4 out of the country. He brought them to the United States. And then, for years, he tried to sell them. I want to stay with the geography for one more moment, because the geography is why the scrolls survived, and everything about tonight depends on that survival. Organic material, leather, papyrus, linen, wood, deteriorates in the presence of moisture and oxygen and biological activity. Bacteria break down cellulose, moisture promotes mold, insects eat protein. The ordinary fate of an ancient document is to disappear within a few decades of the death of the person who wrote it, unless extraordinary steps are taken to prevent the process. You have almost certainly touched something that has travelled from one hand to another across a very long time. A book, a coin, a photograph, an object you inherited. The sense that comes with that touch, the feeling of the distance between you and whoever last held it, is the texture of this entire story. The Dead Sea Basin prevented it by accident. The relative humidity in the caves above the Dead Sea is extraordinarily low, in the range of 20 to 40% in the cave interiors, depending on season and depth. At that humidity level, the biological processes that eat organic material essentially stop. No mold grows. The bacteria that break down leather and linen require water that is not there. The air in the caves is, chemically speaking, a preserving medium, not deliberately, not by design, but by the specific accident of geography that put an endoric salt lake in the deepest part of a geological rift valley in one of the driest climates on Earth. The scrolls were also helped by the jars. The ceramic jars are not generic pots. They are a specific form, tall, cylindrical, with a particular lid design that sits flush with the jar's rim and can be sealed. The clay they are made from fires to a particular hardness. They are not as airtight as a modern vacuum-sealed container, but they substantially reduce the exchange of air and moisture between the cave environment and the scroll interior. When Muhammad Eddib opened the jars in 1947, he was, in effect, breaking a seal that had been set in approximately 68 AD and had held for nearly 19 centuries. Now, the first purchase. The scroll market that developed in 1947 and 1948 was informal, fast, and complicated by the fact that Palestine was disintegrating as a political entity. The Bedouin who had found the scrolls needed to sell them to someone who could pay. Kando, the Bethlehem Cobbler, was the broker, the person who knew both the Bedouin community and the small world of Jerusalem antiquities dealers and the institutions behind them. He was not a villain in this story, despite his central role in a process that professional archaeology found deeply uncomfortable. He was a businessman, operating in the market that existed. With the contacts he had, he made money. He also facilitated the survival of documents that might otherwise have been dispersed beyond any possibility of scholarly recovery. The 4 scrolls that Mar Samuel acquired included the Great Isaiah Scroll, the Community Rule, the Habakkuk Commentary, a verse-by-verse interpretation of the prophet Habakkuk, applying its words to the community's own historical situation, and the Genesis Apocryphon, a text that retells and elaborates stories from the book of Genesis in an Aramaic paraphrase. The 3 scrolls Sukenik acquired included the War Scroll and 2 others, a collection of Thanksgiving hymns, poems in the voice of someone speaking to God about suffering and faith, and a second, smaller version of some of the War Scroll material. 2 institutions, 2 families of texts, 1 site, 1 find, and a world that had been looking for ancient manuscripts for a century and had not expected to find them in a goat herder's casual morning. The Wall Street Journal advertisement ran on June 1st, 1954. It read, "In the Miscellaneous For Sale column, 4 Dead Sea Scrolls, biblical manuscripts dating back to at least 200 BC, are ideal for gift to educational or religious institution. Box 206, Wall Street Journal." The person who answered the ad did so through an intermediary to avoid being identified. He purchased the 4 scrolls for $250,000, a sum assembled from anonymous donors in the days after he saw the advertisement. He was Yigael Yadin, Israeli general, archaeologist, and the son of Eliezer Sukenik, the man who had bought the other 3 scrolls from Kando in November 1947. The son bought back what his father had tried to buy and failed. The family was complete. All 7 Cave 1 scrolls were now in Israeli hands, and they went to the Shrine of the Book, the dedicated wing of the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, designed specifically to house them, where the Great Isaiah Scroll unrolls today in its full 7-meter length under a circular dome of white concrete. I should add one more layer to the geography before we leave it: the view from the cliff. If you stand at the mouth of Cave 1 and look west and south, you can see the ruins of Qumran below you on the terrace. The distance is perhaps 500 meters, across a slope of broken limestone and pale marl. You can see the remains of the settlement's towers, the outlines of the cisterns, the long, low form of what was once the communal hall. And you can look past the settlement to the Dead Sea itself, the salt surface glittering below, the Jordanian mountains rising beyond it, and the long, straight horizon that is the eastern edge of the Rift Valley. On a clear day, you can see 30 kilometers or more. Settle a little deeper. The credibility base is solid here, named archaeologists, dated excavations, measured cave dimensions, specific manuscripts. Everything I've told you in this segment is in the published record. The people who carried scrolls to Cave 1 from Qumran climbed with that view to their right. They could see the whole landscape of their world from the path up the cliff, the settlement, the water, the mountains, the sky. They knew where they were. They knew what they were doing. And when they turned and went into the cave and set the jars against the wall, they turned away from all of it into the dark. The November 1947 coincidence is worth dwelling on, because the timing has a quality that is hard to describe without overstating it. The United Nations General Assembly voted on the partition plan on November 29, 1947. On that same day, or within a day or two, the exact chronology is slightly uncertain, Eleazar Sukenik was arranging through an intermediary to examine one of the scrolls that Kando was brokering. The intermediary was an Armenian antiques dealer in Jerusalem named Faidi Salahi. Sukenik met Salahi at a barbed wire boundary between the Jewish and Arab sectors of the divided city, and Salahi passed a fragment of scroll through the wire for Sukenik to examine. Sukenik looked at it. He recognized the script, and he made the decision to buy. The following days were some of the most violent and chaotic in the history of the modern city. The partition vote had passed, and the fighting that would eventually become the 1948 war was already beginning in the streets. Sukenik travelled on December 22nd to Bethlehem to examine the scrolls more carefully, a journey through territory that was becoming increasingly dangerous. He held the scrolls for several hours. He brought them back to Jerusalem. He told his diary that he felt as though he had been given a gift from history at the exact moment that history was most turbulent. He was right about both things. The gift was real, and the turbulence was only beginning. Mar Samuel's 4 scrolls and Sukenik's 3 were separated by the same turbulence, separated geographically, institutionally, legally, and eventually nationally, as Mar Samuel took his 4 to the United States, and Israel became the country that held Sukenik's 3. For 7 years, the Library of Cave 1 was split between a bishop's collection in New Jersey and a university archive in Jerusalem, the halves not knowing quite what to do with each other. Yigael Yardin's purchase brought them back together. The son of the man who bought 3 in the worst week of the war bought 4 more through a classified ad. The family was complete, and the Shrine of the Book, the museum designed to house all 7, was built on that reunion. He tried museums, he tried universities, he tried private collectors. Nobody was willing to pay what he was asking for scrolls that, however obviously ancient, had a provenance that no established institution could formally verify in those years. In June of 1954, Mar Samuel placed a small advertisement in the Wall Street Journal. Keep 4 words in mind, 4 words from a newspaper. Miscellaneous for sale. We will read that advertisement aloud later tonight. And the person who eventually answered it, the person who bought those 4 scrolls back, is one of the stranger coincidences in the history of scholarship. But that is for later. Right now, we need to go back to the cliffs. Because in the 7 years between the shepherd's stone and the newspaper advertisement, something had been quietly happening in the desert above the Dead Sea. Cave 1 was not the only cave. It was not even close to the most important one. And the people who were finding the rest were not archaeologists. Let me tell you what was actually in the first cave, before we go looking for the others. Because the contents are strange in a specific way. Not strange in the way that fringe documentaries mean, but strange in the way that real history is strange when you slow down and read it carefully. The 7 scrolls from Cave 1 include some of the most important documents ever recovered from the ancient world, and they sit together in a combination that should make you stop and think about whoever made the choice to put them here. The first scroll that gets examined, the one that will eventually be known as the Great Isaiah Scroll, is a complete copy of the Book of Isaiah, all 66 chapters, from the opening vision to the final promise, on a single piece of parchment stitched together from 17 sheets of animal skin, sewn end to end and rolled up. It is just over 7 meters long. You could unroll it and walk the length of a good-sized room, and it would still be going. At the time it was found, the oldest known Hebrew copy of the Book of Isaiah dated to 895 of the Common Era, a medieval manuscript, held in a library in Aleppo, carefully preserved by scribes who had copied it from earlier copies, which had been copied from still earlier copies, across more than a millennium of faithful transmission. The Great Isaiah Scroll is approximately 1,000 years older than that manuscript. 1,000 years, not a century, not a generation, not the lifetime of a tradition, an entire millennium sitting between what the world had and what the cave gave back. And when scholars compared the two, the medieval copy and the ancient one, they found something that is either profoundly reassuring or quietly astonishing, depending on how you look at it. The text is substantially the same. Chapter by chapter, the words that had been transmitted by hand across 1,000 years of political upheaval, religious persecution, the destruction of Jerusalem, multiple exiles, and the total disruption of the culture that produced the text. Those words are, with very minor variations, the words in our copies today. The copying worked, the transmission held. Across 10 centuries of catastrophe, the words stayed. Most accounts of the Dead Sea Scrolls, when they mention the Isaiah scroll, stop at that point. But there is a detail almost nobody mentions, and it is the one that stops you cold when you read the original excavation reports. Let your body rest in this moment. The Isaiah scroll is safe. The details can wash over you at whatever pace the night sets. The scroll is not pristine. It shows evidence of heavy use before it was sealed in the jar. The leather has been repaired in sections, patches of newer skin sewn over worn areas, and some of the writing shows corrections written between the lines by a different hand. Somebody was using this scroll, actively using it, reading it, repairing it, reading it again. It was not placed in the jar as a precious artifact to be preserved for posterity. It was placed there as a working document, something that was part of daily life, sealed away because there was no longer time for daily life. The cliff air went still, and it stayed still for 19 centuries. Here is the replay fact for tonight's 25th minute, because this is one of those details worth carrying through the night. The Great Isaiah Scroll is complete, more than 7 meters long, 1,000 years older than any previously known copy of its text, and it is substantially the same text. The copying held. Someone repaired it, read it, sealed it in a jar, and climbed down a cliff in the dark. And 1,000 years of faithful copying later, it said the same thing it said the night the jar was closed. Now, the Great Isaiah Scroll is not even the strangest object in those 7 documents. There is also a document called the Community Rule. It is a manual, a constitution, a set of instructions for how a specific community of people were supposed to live together. It covers entrance procedures for new members. It covers the hierarchy of the group. It covers what happens when someone lies to the community, when someone falls asleep during a communal assembly, when someone speaks disrespectfully to a priest. It has sections on the annual ceremony at which members renewed their commitment. It has a detailed theology, a belief that the world was divided between the forces of light and the forces of darkness, that the community's purpose was to be and to produce the sons of light. This document did not exist before 1947, Nobody had ever seen it. No medieval copy survived. No ancient historian mentioned it specifically. It came out of a jar in a cave as something completely new, a window into a community the written record had not fully preserved. The great Isaiah scroll you could have predicted if you were betting on what an ancient Jewish community might choose to save. The community rule is a surprise. The combination of the two, a carefully preserved copy of their scripture alongside their own rulebook, tells you something specific about whoever sealed this cave. This was not a random selection of valuables. This was a library. Someone made choices about what mattered. Let me tell you about the Habakkuk commentary, because it is the text that most directly shows you what kind of community produced this library. And it is the text that most people skip. Think about what you would do with a correction you found in a sacred text. The community's scribe noticed a scribal mistake, took the time to fix it, and kept using the scroll. The book mattered too much to leave imperfect. The book of Habakkuk is a minor prophetic text, 2.5 chapters, one of the shorter books in the Hebrew Bible, written in the late 7th century BCE. It is structured as a dialogue between the prophet and God about the problem of injustice. Why do the wicked prosper while the righteous suffer? God answers, approximately, that the Babylonians are coming and will sweep everything away, including the wicked, though in a way that may not comfort the righteous much. The Habakkuk commentary takes this text and does something very specific with it. It quotes the original text in full, a verse or two at a time, and then provides an interpretation. Pesha, in Hebrew, a particular form of biblical interpretation that reads the ancient text as being specifically about the community's own time. The commentary is not saying that Habakkuk was addressing ancient Babylonians. It is saying that Habakkuk was addressing the community in the 1st century BCE, that the teacher of righteousness, mentioned in the commentary, is a specific historical figure who was persecuted by a wicked priest, that the Kittim, who appear in the text, are the Romans, that the words of the ancient prophet have their true meaning in the community's current circumstances. This is a community that read their scripture as being about themselves, specifically, precisely, presently about themselves, not as a general religious inspiration, but as a coded message from the past that, read correctly, revealed the present. And the teacher of righteousness and the wicked priest who appear in the commentary are presumably real people who were known to the community's original readers, whose identities have been one of the central mysteries of Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship for 70 years. Who was the teacher of righteousness? The scholarly literature has proposed multiple identifications, none of them fully convincing to the whole field. A high priest of the 2nd century BCE who was displaced by a Hasmonean ruler, a reforming figure who led the community into the desert after failing to reform the Jerusalem establishment, someone whose name is known from another source, and someone whose name has been lost entirely. The commentary refers to him with great reverence and describes his persecution with great feeling. He matters enormously to whoever wrote this text. His name is not given. His face is not described. He exists in the Habakkuk commentary as a function, as the righteous one, persecuted, vindicated by the text of the ancient prophet. And then he disappears back into the dark. The limestone cliff face is cool beneath your hand, if you imagine pressing it against the rock. The stone has been at the same temperature for centuries. The cave mouth is just above, barely visible in the pale rock. There is a specific detail about the great Isaiah scroll that I have been saving for this moment, because it connects the text to the community in a way that most accounts of the scroll do not dwell on. The scroll has been corrected multiple times by multiple hands. The original scribe wrote his text, and then another person came through with a different pen and marked corrections above the lines and in the margins. Scholars can identify at least 2 distinct correcting hands in the manuscript. This is not unusual for a much-used working copy of a text. It is exactly what you would expect from a scroll that was part of daily study, taken out regularly, read aloud at communal gatherings, used for instruction, repaired when worn. You're somewhere between the first time you've heard some of this and the dreaming that comes after understanding. Both are fine, let it settle. But here is the specific detail. In chapter 40 of Isaiah, the famous consolation chapters, the passage that begins, "Comfort, comfort my people," there is a correction. The original scribe wrote a line, and then a corrector came along and changed a word. The word that was changed is a small word, a grammatical particle, a detail that most readers would not notice and that does not affect the overall meaning of the verse. But it is exactly the kind of change that a community of careful readers, studying the text closely for the pesher meaning, the hidden present application, would notice and care about. They were reading this scroll the way you would read a book you believed was secretly about your own life, and they found a mistake, and someone took the time to fix it. The ink on the corrector's mark has been analyzed. It is slightly different in composition from the main text ink, applied at a different period. The correction was not made when the scroll was first written. It was made later, after study had revealed the error. The scroll was in use long enough for the community to identify and correct a scribal mistake. This is the texture of the life that produced the library. Not abstract, not monumental, but corrected and repaired and read again. The specificity of the community rule has another dimension that most accounts skip past. The rule describes an annual ceremony called the covenant renewal. Once a year, the full community gathered for a liturgical ceremony in which the priests recited the blessings that came with obedience to the covenant, and the Levites recited the curses that came with disobedience. The same structure as the ceremony described in Deuteronomy 27, but applied to the community's specific circumstances. The members of the community crossed from one side to the other, physically moving from the group of the cursed to the group of the blessed, renewing their commitment. This is not abstract theology. This is choreography, a specific physical arrangement of bodies in a specific space, performing a specific liturgical movement annually. When DeVoe found the large communal hall at Qumran, long enough for a significant gathering, with evidence of its use for formal occasions, the covenant renewal ceremony is exactly the kind of thing it was built for. The architecture and the text interpret each other. The hall was built for the ceremony. The ceremony was performed in the hall. The scrolls are the document collection of a community that had designed its daily life, its architecture, its ceramics, its water system, its writing practice, its annual ceremonies, around a specific theological vision. The library is not separate from the life. It is the life, written down. And alongside the institutional documents, a text of extraordinary personal intensity. The Thanksgiving hymns, written in first person, addressed to God, describing experiences of persecution, isolation, and ultimate trust in divine faithfulness, are the closest thing in the collection to a private voice. They may be the voice of the teacher of righteousness. They may be a communal composition in a conventionalized first-person register. But they are, either way, the most intimate writing in the library, the sound of someone talking to God about what it costs to live the way this community lived. And there were 10 more caves. One scroll in this story is not made of leather at all. We'll open it late tonight, when the hour is quieter. For now, we need to follow the people who were finding the rest of the caves, because the race that began in the desert above the Dead Sea in the late 1940s is one of the most unusual competitions in the history of scholarship, and the winner was not who anyone expected. The cave hunters were Bedouin. This is the part of the story that most textbook accounts compress into a sentence and move past. Between 1949 and 1956, the Ta'mireh, the same tribe that had produced Muhammad ed-Dib, the same community of pastoral people who knew the limestone cliffs the way most people know the streets of their own neighborhood, systematically searched the ravines and rock faces above the Dead Sea in a way that professional archaeology could not match in speed or in local knowledge. They found caves 2, 3, 4, 5, and several more before the official excavations reached them. They sold what they found to Kando, who sold it on to institutions. It was an informal supply chain operating at the margins of a formal discipline, and the result was that many of the most important fragments arrived in scholarly hands through the market rather than through the excavation trench. Scholars argued about this for decades. Some still argue about it, but the argument misses something important. Without the Bedouin, the caves would have been found more slowly, the fragments would have been dispersed less predictably, and the academic world that was not looking for them would have had even less chance of finding them in time. Let me tell you about the specific caves. Cave 2, found by Bedouin in 1952, contained fragments of more than 30 manuscripts, pieces of Jubilees, the Book of Enoch, a text about the New Jerusalem. Cave 3, also found in 1952, contained something that the archaeologists who excavated it afterward were completely unprepared for. Something that was not a leather scroll or a papyrus fragment or a parchment page. Something metal. Something that had been rolled up like a scroll but couldn't be unrolled because it was made of copper and the metal had oxidized stiff over 19 centuries. They photographed it. They noted it. They left it for later because there was, at that moment, no way to open it without destroying it. The copper scroll sits in its case for 3 more years. Cave 4 is the one that changes everything. Remember the whisper loop from near the beginning of tonight. Hold the number, 11 caves. The one that changes everything is not the first, and it will not be found by an archaeologist. Here is the payoff. Cave 4 was found by Bedouin searchers in 1952, and it is not a natural cave. It is a man-made chamber, cut into the marl terrace, the soft, crumbly layer of ancient lakebed sediment that forms the slope below the limestone cliffs. It is cut by human hands into the rock, roughly 2 meters by 2 meters, and it is within sight of the ruins of qumran, the ancient settlement that sits on the terrace above the Dead Sea, barely 200 meters from where Cave 4's mouth opens. The people who made Cave 4 could see the settlement from inside it, or close to it. The settlement was home. Your ear for this is already calibrated from earlier in tonight. You know what it sounds like when scholarship converges, and what it sounds like when it doesn't. Inside Cave 4 were 15,000 fragments. 15,000, not scrolls, not even complete pages, but fragments, pieces, torn and crumbled and compressed into the cave floor over the centuries since the scrolls were either hurriedly deposited and subsequently damaged by flood and time, or were already fragmentary when deposited. The 15,000 fragments represent parts of more than 500 different manuscripts. Some of those manuscripts overlap with texts found in Cave 1. Many of them are texts found nowhere else. The jigsaw has 15,000 pieces. Nobody has a picture of the box. While the cave searches were ongoing, the archaeologist Roland de Vaux, a Dominican priest and scholar based at the École Biblique in Jerusalem, was excavating the ruins at qumran, the settlement on the terrace near Cave 4. The excavations ran from 1951 to 1956, and what de Vaux found there changed the reading of the scrolls as completely as the scrolls had changed the reading of the ancient world. What de Vaux found at Qumran, ritual baths. Multiple large stone cisterns connected to an elaborate water system, pools that could only have been used for ritual purification. A large communal hall, long enough to seat well over 100 people. A pantry adjacent to it containing over 1,000 ceramic vessels, plates, bowls, cups, stacked in rows as if for communal meals. Inkwells, actual ceramic inkwells with traces of dried iron-based ink inside them, found on a long low bench that de Vaux identified as a scriptorium, a writing room, a place where scrolls were produced. and surrounding the site, a cemetery. An unusually large cemetery for such a small settlement, more than 1,000 graves, arranged in careful north-south alignment, marked with stone. A community that bathed ritually, ate communally, wrote intensively, and buried their dead with extraordinary care. The leading explanation, the one that most scholars in the 1950s and early 1960s quickly converged on, is that the settlement was inhabited by the Essenes, a Jewish sect described by ancient writers, including the Jewish historian Josephus and the Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder. Pliny describes a community living on the western shore of the Dead Sea, celibate, possessing no money, dedicating their lives to study and purity. The fit between Pliny's description and what Devoe found at Qumran is striking enough that it became the dominant theory almost immediately. But there are other readings. Some scholars have argued that Qumran was a military fortress rather than a religious community. The inkwells and the ritual baths sitting uneasily with this interpretation, but the site's position above the Dead Sea lending it some strategic logic. Others have proposed that the scrolls are not the library of the Qumran community at all, but an emergency evacuation collection from Jerusalem libraries during the War of 68 AD, books from multiple different groups and traditions, hurriedly mixed and hidden by people fleeing the Roman advance, not by a single unified community. The Wall Street Journal advertisement. We said we would read it aloud, and the moment has come. You are listening, at this hour, to a debate that is still ongoing. The Essene hypothesis is the best fit. It is not the only fit, and you don't need to resolve it tonight. June 1st, 1954. The classified section. Under Miscellaneous For Sale, following an ad for restaurant equipment and preceding one for used office furniture, the 4 Dead Sea Scrolls, biblical manuscripts dating back to at least 200 BC, are ideal as a gift to educational or religious institution by an individual or group. Box 206, Wall Street Journal. That is the advertisement. In full, 12 words of description for the most significant group of ancient manuscripts in modern history. The phrasing, "are ideal as a gift," has something quietly desperate about it in retrospect. 7 years of trying to sell these scrolls through appropriate channels, and the final strategy is the classified ads, with a suggestion that someone might give them as a present. Yigael Yadin read the advertisement in New York, where he was lecturing at the time. He recognized immediately what was being offered. He could not make the purchase in his own name. He was an Israeli general, and the scrolls were at this point legally complicated in terms of their country of origin and proper ownership under international conventions that were still being worked out. He arranged for a proxy purchase through a trusted intermediary. The $250,000 came from anonymous donors he assembled in the days after he saw the advertisement. The deal was done. The 4 scrolls came to Israel, joined the 3 Sukenik had held since 1947, and 7 years after a Bedouin shepherd had broken a clay jar in a cave, the 7 scrolls of Cave 1 were together in the country that would become their permanent home. Yadin gave the scrolls to the State of Israel as a gift, formally presented them to the Prime Minister, and watched the shrine of the book being built to house them. The building, designed by Frederick Kiesler and Armand Bartos, has a white dome intended to evoke the shape of the jar lids from Cave 1. When you visit the Shrine of the Book today, the dome above the entrance hall is a reference to the lid of the jar that Muhammad Dib broke with his stone. Now let me give you the shape of the cave discoveries in order, because the order matters for understanding what was found where. Cave 1, the Shepherd's Cave, was excavated officially in 1949, 2 years after the initial find. The official excavation found additional fragments that the initial visit had missed: bits of linen wrapping, jar fragments, more scraps of leather. The cave was photographed, measured, documented. Cave 2, found by Bedouin in 1952, contained fragments of more than 30 manuscripts, including pieces of Jubilees and Ruth and Jeremiah and the Book of Enoch. The fragments were small and numerous. This was not a carefully organized deposit like Cave 1, but a collection that had been more exposed to the elements and to the slow disintegration of centuries. Cave 3, also 1952, yielded the copper scroll and a small number of other fragments. The copper scroll dominated attention, naturally, because there was nothing else like it, and because nobody could read it yet. Let the ambiguity be comfortable. That's what real history offers you, not certainty, but the specific texture of what is known and the honest shape of what is not. Cave 4, the man-made chamber found by Bedouin that same year, we have already described, but I want to add one detail that puts it in human scale. Cave 4 is so close to the ruins of Qumran that Devoe, when he was excavating the settlement, could stand in the ruins and look across at the cave mouth. The people who made Cave 4 could, on a clear day, be seen from the windows of the scriptorium. The library and the cave were neighbours. The people who carried the scrolls to Cave 4 were carrying them a very short distance. Caves 5 through 10 were smaller deposits, mixed fragments, some in good condition, some not. Cave 11, found in 1956, and the last cave found in the original period of discovery, yielded the Psalms scroll, a large, well-preserved scroll containing a substantial portion of the Psalms, arranged in a slightly different order than the standard biblical sequence, and the Temple scroll, which was not, however, surrendered to the scholarly world at the time. It went to Kando, and it went under his floor in Bethlehem, where it waited. 11 caves. The distribution of material across them is itself a kind of record. The most carefully organized deposits, Cave 1 with its sealed jars, Cave 11 with its well-preserved scrolls, suggest deliberate archiving. The heaped fragments of Cave 4 suggest either haste or subsequent disturbance or both. The copper scroll in Cave 3, sitting alone, rolled up and unable to be opened, suggests that whoever put it there treated it as different from the rest, requiring its own space and its own seal. And Roland Devoe's excavation at Qumran gives you the frame for all of it. The inkwells are perhaps the most important objects he found, more important in a way than the ritual baths or the communal hall, because they are the physical connection between the settlement and the scrolls. Carbon-based ink in ceramic inkwells, the same composition as the ink on the scrolls, found in a room that has the dimensions and configuration of a scriptorium. The scrolls were not shipped in from somewhere else. They were made here. The hands that pressed the letters into the leather in the caves made the ink in the pots on the bench in the room by the Dead Sea. The alternative theories about who used Qumran deserve one more paragraph of honest attention. The fortress hypothesis, the idea that Qumran was primarily a military installation, has difficulty with the inkwells. Military installations do not typically produce ceramic inkwells. The water system, while large enough to support a garrison, has the stepped ritual bath design that is specific to Jewish purity practice, not to military water supply. The cemetery of more than 1,000 graves is far too large for a garrison of the size the site could have supported. Military cemeteries do not typically contain so many graves relative to the likely living population of the site. The Jerusalem library hypothesis, the idea that the scrolls represent a cross-section of first-century Judean libraries evacuated to the desert rather than the specific library of a single community, has more scholarly support than the fortress hypothesis. Some of the texts found in the caves do not fit neatly into the specific theology of the Qumran community, as described by the community rule. Some of them appear to represent different and even competing theological positions. If the library were purely the product of a single unified community, you might not expect to find texts that seem to argue against that community's own positions. The most honest summary is that the Essene hypothesis fits most of the evidence better than any alternative, while acknowledging that several features of the collection remain puzzling on that hypothesis, and that the alternatives address real difficulties. The scholarly consensus is not monolithic. and it should not be. A library this complex, from a period this turbulent, does not resolve neatly into a single explanation. That is not a weakness. That is what real history looks like. Who they were is still argued in journals today. What is not argued is what they left. And what they left, it turns out, is something far more than a collection of biblical texts. Let's do what almost no retelling of this story makes time for. Let's actually walk the shelves. The shelves of the Dead Sea Library run in 4 different directions, and each one opens onto a different world. The first shelf, the most expected, the most professionally significant to the scholarship of the time, is the biblical shelf. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls, scholars have identified fragments or complete copies of every book of the Hebrew Bible but one. Every book. The Torah in its 5 sections, the historical books, the prophets, the wisdom literature, Psalms, Proverbs, Job. They are all here, in copies that in most cases predate by many centuries the manuscripts that scholarship had been working from. And the one book that isn't present, the one gap in the library's collection of Hebrew scripture, is the Book of Esther. Scholars have proposed reasons for this absence. Esther is unusual in the Hebrew Bible in that it does not contain the name of God. The text is a court drama, a survival story set in the Persian diaspora, and the divine is conspicuously absent from its pages. The community that assembled this library may have had theological reasons for excluding it, or the Esther fragments may exist and simply haven't been found, or the book may have been kept elsewhere. Nobody knows. What the community kept of the biblical texts reveals their priorities. They have multiple copies of some books. The Psalms appear in more than 30 fragmentary copies, more than any other biblical text. Isaiah appears in more than 20 copies. Deuteronomy, the great covenantal book of law and instruction, also in more than 20. The books they copied most are the books that most directly address the terms of the covenant between a people and their God, the promises, the conditions, the consequences of keeping or breaking the compact. These are the books of a community that took the covenant very seriously. But the biblical shelf is not what makes this library strange. It is the document beside it. The community rule is not the only original document from the settlement's own hand. Alongside it, the library contains a document called the War Scroll, a detailed, practical military manual describing the final eschatological battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. It has formations, battle plans, a description of the trumpets that will sound different signals for different maneuvers, the words to be inscribed on the banners of each troop division. It is written as if the community expects to be on the battlefield, commanded by God, fighting the final war. And alongside the War Scroll is the Temple Scroll, the longest of all the Dead Sea documents at nearly 9 meters, which presents a detailed blueprint for a new, purified temple, built to exact specifications that differ in specific ways from the temple that stood in Jerusalem. The community that produced this scroll was not in Jerusalem. They were in the desert, and they had detailed architectural plans for the temple that they believed should replace the one they had left. The replay fact for tonight's 55th minute is this. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls there is a community calendar, a calendar that runs on a solar year of 364 days, dividing the year into precisely 4 quarters of exactly 13 weeks each. It is a more mathematically elegant calendar than the lunar calendar used in the Jerusalem temple. And the community at Qumran believed, genuinely, devoutly believed, that Jerusalem was keeping the wrong time, that the festivals were being celebrated on the wrong days, that the entire religious year of the Jewish people was synchronized to the wrong calendar, and that this error made the temple rituals invalid. Think about what that means. These people were living in the desert, copying their scripture with extraordinary care, planning for a final war, drawing up blueprints for a new temple, because they believed the religious establishment of their time was fundamentally in error. They were not fringe. They were meticulous. and they were patient. The patient calm of the limestone cliffs, the air dry and still, the date palms along the shore below, moving in no wind at this hour. The second shelf is the one that, if you have been following this channel for a while, will feel like a door opening onto a familiar room. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls are multiple copies of books that do not appear in the Hebrew Bible, books that were known about, referred to, and in some cases apparently treated as scripture by ancient Jewish communities, but that did not survive in the tradition that eventually became the Hebrew Bible as we know it. Books that were, depending on how you read the history, lost, excluded, or forgotten. The Book of Enoch is here, not a complete copy, but fragments of Aramaic text representing parts of multiple sections of the Enochic literature, the books of the Watchers, the astronomical book, the Book of Dreams, the Epistle of Enoch. The community at Qumran possessed copies of Enoch, multiple copies. In a library this carefully assembled, multiple copies of a text is a signal this was not a curiosity on the shelf. This was a text they read and read again. Your breath is slower than it was at the beginning of tonight. The library has been around you for an hour now. You don't need to hold every detail. The jars will hold them for you. The Book of Jubilees is here in a dozen copies, more copies than almost any other non-biblical text in the collection. Jubilees is a retelling of Genesis and Exodus, organized around the community's 364-day calendar, and its presence in so many copies suggests it may have had something close to scriptural status for whoever assembled this library. And the Book of Giants is here, the text in which the Watcher's offspring, the giants, have dreams of the coming flood, and in which a figure named Gilgamesh, the hero of the oldest story in human literature, walks through a Jewish text by name, translated from the Mesopotamian tradition into the Aramaic voice of Second Temple Judaism. If you have been with this channel through the nights we've spent with the Book of Enoch, with the Watchers and the Giants and the Flood, the caves above the Dead Sea are where those texts come from. The fragments we've been talking about across those videos were found here, in jars, in a man-made chamber in a marl terrace, by Bedouin searchers who had no idea what they were holding. The library that produced those nights is this library. The floor of Cave 4 is the ground beneath every one of those conversations. If you're still awake at this point in the night, and wherever you are, in whatever time zone and whatever dark, I want to ask you something. If you could preserve one book for 2,000 years, knowing that the world you live in was about to end, which one would it be? Tell me below. I'm genuinely curious. Someone 2,000 years ago faced exactly that question, and their answers are still being read. The third shelf is the most literal and the most baffling. When archaeologists opened Cave 3 in 1952, they found a scroll unlike any other in the collection. It was made of copper, 2 sheets of thin copper, riveted together and rolled up, and it had been lying on the cave floor long enough that the copper had fully oxidized. The scroll could not be unrolled without shattering. The edges were corroded, whatever was written on it, and the raised marks of letters were dimly visible on the outer surface, was not readable without first somehow opening the metal. It sat in the Rockefeller Museum in Jerusalem for 3 years. Nobody could agree on how to open it. In 1955, it was carefully transported to Manchester, England, where a team led by Professor John Allegro used a precision saw to cut the scroll into 23 strips, working through the metal with great care and unrolling each strip as the cut freed it. The reading began in 1955 and continued into 1956. What the copper scroll says is this: it is a list of hiding places, column after column, and there are 12 columns, naming locations and describing what is buried there. At the first location, a certain number of talents of gold and silver. At the second, a different quantity, buried at a specific depth. The locations are described in terms of geography: a certain cistern, a certain tomb, a particular distance from a particular landmark, that presuppose knowledge of a specific landscape. The total weight of gold and silver described, if taken literally, is extraordinary. Some estimates run into the hundreds of tons. Nothing on the Copper Scrolls list has ever been found. The expeditions that followed the scroll's publication were earnest and professional. The geographical references were analyzed, debated, and in some cases matched to specific locations in the landscape of ancient Judea. Excavations were carried out. Nothing was found. The hiding places, if they were ever real, are either too deeply buried, too thoroughly looted in antiquity, or described in terms specific enough to be understood only by someone who already knew the landscape from the inside. There are three serious readings of the Copper Scroll among scholars. The first is that it describes a real treasury, actual gold and silver hidden by the Jerusalem temple before the Roman conquest, with the Copper Scroll as a last desperate inventory. The second is that it describes the same community's own stores, hidden along with the manuscripts during the emergency of 68 AD. The third, held by a minority but not a negligible one, is that it is a work of ancient fiction, a list of idealized treasures from a lost golden age, inscribed on copper precisely because copper is permanent, a monument not to real wealth, but to remembered or imagined wealth. All three readings have something to recommend them. None of them has been decisively proved. The Copper Scroll is the only object in the entire Dead Sea collection for which archaeology has produced no confirming evidence either way. It sits in the Jordan Museum in Amman, in a climate-controlled case, and it does not give up its treasure, and it does not admit to being fictional. That is what honest mystery looks like, not suppressed and not resolved. If you're drifting at this point, that's exactly right. The library was designed to be studied slowly, over years, over a lifetime. You can come back. The fourth shelf is the quietest, and in some ways, the most affecting. We know a great deal about what the people who assembled this library believed. We know their theology, their calendar, their rules, their battle plans, their architectural dreams. What is harder to find in the documents, because documents record the formal and the official, is what a day actually felt like at Qumran. But the archaeology offers something. You can reconstruct the rough shape of a day in the settlement, from what Deveau found in the excavations, combined with what the community rule prescribes. The settlement woke before dawn. The community rule describes an extended period of scripture study and prayer before sunrise. Members gathered at the water cisterns for ritual immersion, not a quick splash, but a full immersion in cold water, in the dark before the desert sun came up. Then the shared meal. The pantry beside the communal hall held enough vessels for a large community to eat together. Plates, bowls, cups, all stacked. The community rule describes the meal as a formal occasion, with a priest reciting a blessing over the bread and over the wine. The meal was sacred. The bread was not ordinary food. And then, in the scriptorium, the long, low room with the benches and the inkwells, the scribes worked. The leather had to be prepared, the ink mixed, the columns ruled out with a sharp instrument. A trained scribe writing in a careful hand could produce perhaps a page or two of careful manuscript per day. The Great Isaiah Scroll, 17 stitched sheets, more than 7 meters of text, represents weeks of a single scribe's working life, possibly months. The sun moved across the limestone. The date palms along the shore below moved when there was wind. At the end of the day, another communal meal. More prayer. The lamps burned low. Let me slow down on the community rule for a moment, because the rulebook is the text that most reveals what kind of community this was. The community rule covers, in practical detail, the daily operations of a community in which membership is voluntary, hierarchical, and subject to continuous review. New members served a probationary period of at least 2 years before full admission. During probation, they could participate in the community's study sessions, but not in the communal meal. The sacred shared food was restricted to full members. If a probationary member was found to have lied about his wealth, or to have violated the community's rules in some substantive way, his probation could be extended, or he could be expelled. Expulsion was possible for full members too. The rule lists specific offences and their penalties, some resulting in temporary reduction in food rations, some in temporary expulsion from the community, some in permanent exclusion. Lying to the community was a serious offence. Bearing a grudge against a fellow member was an offence. Interrupting another member during a discussion was an offence, penalised by reduced rations for 10 days. Sleeping during a session of the community assembly was an offence, penalised by a reduction in rations for 30 days. The rule is not abstract theology. It is a working document for a specific, real community of people who had to figure out how to live together without killing each other. And it contains, alongside the practical regulations, passages of extraordinary intensity. Passages about the spiritual war between light and darkness, about the angel of darkness who leads humanity into error, about the community's role as bearers of light in a world that is largely dark. The theology and the dormitory rules exist in the same document because the community that produced the document was both a spiritual movement and a household. The Thanksgiving hymns, the third major Cave 1 document, are, as the name suggests, a collection of first-person poems of gratitude and lament addressed to God. Scholars have argued about whether they were composed by the teacher of righteousness himself. Their intensity and their specific descriptions of persecution and isolation have led some to read them as autobiography, or whether they are a communal composition in a conventionalized first-person voice. Nobody has settled this. What can be said is that the poems are the most personal writing in the entire collection, the closest thing in the library to a diary. There is a specific passage in the hymns that I keep coming back to, because it articulates what the community understood itself to be doing in the desert. The translation varies depending on the translator, but the core of it is, "You have placed me as a banner for the elect of righteousness, and as an interpreter of knowledge in the wondrous mysteries, to test those who seek truth, and to try those who love correction." A banner, not a sword, not a fortress, not a king. A banner, a signal, a visible mark, something that says we are here, we are different. Those who recognize the difference can find their way to it. The community in the desert was a library. The library was the message. The message was, we kept the words right. Come and read them. Let the banned shelf sit beside you for a moment. Enoch, Jubilees, the Book of Giants. Books your ancestors may have read without knowing they were banned. Books that went underground for 2,000 years and came back. Now let me give you more of the banned shelf, because the connection between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the texts we've explored on earlier nights in this channel is tighter than most retellings acknowledge. The Book of Enoch survives today, in its complete form only in the Ethiopian Orthodox canon, where it has been preserved for 2 millennia as scripture. In the rest of the world's religious traditions, it was lost. Medieval Christian scholars knew about it from references in other texts. The letter of Jude in the New Testament quotes it directly. The early Christian writer Tertullian argued it should be considered scripture, but the actual text was unavailable in Europe until James Bruce brought Ethiopic manuscripts back from Abyssinia in the late 18th century, and the book was not available in English translation until 1821. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Book of Enoch appears in Aramaic. Aramaic fragments of multiple sections, the books of the Watchers, the Astronomical Book, the Dream Visions, the Epistle, give us portions of the text in what is presumably close to its original language of composition. These fragments predate the Ethiopic translation by centuries. They are not copies of a translation. They are copies of, or close to, the source. And the community at Qumran was reading this text, in multiple copies, alongside the Torah and Isaiah and the Psalms. Enoch sat on the same shelf as Deuteronomy. Whatever boundary eventually formed between scripture and non-scripture, whatever process of exclusion separated the texts that survived into the biblical canon from the texts that were excluded from it, that boundary had not formed, or had formed differently, for the people who assembled this library. The Book of Jubilees presents a similar picture. 12 copies of Jubilees among the Dead Sea Scrolls, more copies than almost any other text in the collection. Jubilees retells the narratives of Genesis and Exodus, organized around the community's own 364-day calendar, framing the patriarchal stories as events that occurred on specific days of that calendar. It is a sustained argument, in narrative form, that the calendar question is not a minor liturgical technicality, but a fundamental question of covenant faithfulness. You cannot keep the covenant correctly if you are observing its festivals on the wrong days. The Qumran community read Jubilees as a companion to Genesis, the way most readers treat a study Bible. The two texts illuminated each other, and both of them sat next to the Book of Giants. The Book of Giants is perhaps the strangest member of this family. It is a text that develops the brief narrative of the Watchers and their offspring from Genesis 6, the sons of God who came to earth and had children with human women, producing the giants, into a full apocalyptic narrative. The giants have dreams. They consult the imprisoned Watchers about the meaning of the dreams. A series of dreamlike sequences follows, culminating in the approach of the flood. And among the giants, the text includes the name Gilgamesh, in Aramaic transliteration unmistakable, as one of the giant figures who receives and interprets dreams. The hero of the oldest story in human literature, first recorded on Sumerian clay tablets more than 4,000 years ago, walks through a Jewish apocalyptic text in Aramaic. He has been translated from Akkadian into the framework of Second Temple Jewish cosmology, transformed from a Mesopotamian king into one of the offspring of the Watchers, and his presence in the text is not incidental. He is a significant figure in the dream narrative. Whoever composed the Book of Giants knew the Gilgamesh tradition and deliberately incorporated it. They were doing comparative mythology in the 2nd century BCE, drawing lines between the flood story in Genesis and the flood story in Gilgamesh, between the giants of Jewish tradition and the heroes of Mesopotamian legend. The Dead Sea Scrolls are the library where that connection was preserved, and they are the reason we have it tonight. The caves are the ground beneath every night we have spent in this channel with Enoch, with the Watchers, with the giants. This is where the texts come from. This is the floor. The cutting of the copper scroll in Manchester deserves its own slow reading. By the time the scroll arrived at the College of Technology in Manchester in 1955, it had been sitting in the Rockefeller Museum for 3 years, oxidized stiff, its contents unknown. Professor John Allegro, who was one of the 8 original team members assigned to the Cave 4 fragments, and who would later become the most controversial figure in Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship for reasons unrelated to the copper scroll, was present for the cutting. He had argued for opening the scroll from the beginning and had advocated for its transportation to Manchester, where the mechanical engineering faculty had the precision tools required. The saw used was a small circular saw with a blade thin enough to cut through the oxidized copper without destroying the letters on the surface. The scroll was cut lengthwise into 23 vertical strips. As each strip was freed from the roll, it could be opened flat, and the letters inscribed on its interior surface could be read for the first time in 19 centuries. The cliffs are very still. The Dead Sea is doing what the Dead Sea does at this hour, holding its salt, holding its silence, holding the reflection of whatever light is available in the night sky above it. Allegro was the first person to read the full text, strip by strip, as the cutting proceeded. He published a preliminary account of the contents almost immediately, ahead of the official scholarly publication, and the resulting dispute with the official team was one of the first controversies in a history of the scrolls that was to contain many. But the contents he described were accurate. The copper scroll is a list of hiding places for treasure, and it says what he said it said. Here is a specific entry from the copper scroll, because the specificity of the language is part of what makes the document so fascinating and so frustrating. The text refers to a location described in terms of a specific architectural feature at a specific site, the kind of description that would be perfectly clear to someone who knew the landscape and perfectly opaque to someone who did not. Then it gives a quantity, so many talents of gold. A talent of gold in the ancient Near East was approximately 30 kilograms. The quantities given across the 60-plus entries of the copper scroll total something in the range of 65 tons of gold and 26 tons of silver, plus various other precious objects. If taken literally, this is an enormous quantity, far beyond what a small desert community could have accumulated. This is part of what leads some scholars to the Jerusalem Temple treasury hypothesis. Only an institution of the scale of the first or second temple could have accumulated wealth at this scale, and the scroll may be a record of where that wealth was hidden during one of the many times the temple was threatened. But the if taken literally is the hinge. Every serious treasure hunt that has followed the scroll's publication has come up empty. The geographical descriptions, while specific, cannot be unambiguously matched to locations in the landscape because the landscape has changed, the relevant settlement names have changed, and several of the key landmarks referred to in the scroll have not been identified to scholarly satisfaction. John Marco Allegro, the controversial, difficult, brilliant scholar who first read the scroll in Manchester, spent years pursuing the treasure and found nothing. A more recent expedition in the early 1960s, led by a different team, also found nothing. The treasure, if it exists, has not been found by any of the people who have gone looking for it since the scroll was opened. That is the honest state of the question. The scroll is real. The text is legible. The locations may be real. The treasure has not been found. The daily life reconstruction matters as much as the theology, and I want to give it more space than most retellings do. The water system at Qumran is one of the most impressive features of the site. The settlement sits in a landscape that receives very little rainfall, perhaps 70 millimeters per year, mostly in winter flash floods. The community solved this by engineering an extensive system of channels and cisterns that caught and stored winter runoff. At the top of the cliff above the settlement, channels cut into the rock-guided rainwater down the slope and into a settling tank, where sediment dropped out, and from there into a series of large stone cisterns. The cisterns, some of them cut from the marl and some constructed from stone, had a combined capacity of more than 1,000 cubic meters of water. This is a remarkable amount of water infrastructure for a community of perhaps 100 to 200 people. DeVoe's excavation identified at least 10 stepped cisterns on the site, the steps allowing easy descent to the water level as the cistern emptied over the dry season. The ritual purity laws that governed the community required immersion, and the water system provided it. The settlement was engineered, from its founding, to make ritual purity sustainable in one of the driest landscapes in the inhabited world. The pottery production is similarly extensive. The ceramic corpus from Qumran is large and fairly standardized, a consistent set of forms, including the cylindrical storage jars found in the caves, produced in quantities that suggest an active pottery workshop on the site. Some of the jars in which the scrolls were found were made at Qumran. The community made its own containers for its own library. This is not a group of people who came to the desert as refugees, disorganized and desperate. This is a community that planned and built and made things and developed a local economy and maintained a writing culture and produced a library. The desert was not chosen as a place of punishment or exile. It was chosen as a place of purity, away from what they saw as the contaminated religious establishment in Jerusalem, close enough to see the smoke when the city finally burned, far enough that the fire would not reach them before they were ready. In the spring of 68 AD, They were not ready. The smoke on the southern horizon was not the apocalyptic smoke they had written about in the war scroll, the smoke of the final battle, after which their side would win. It was ordinary imperial smoke. The legion came up the road, and the daily life of the settlement, the baths, the meals, the bench in the scriptorium with the inkwells, the stacked plates in the pantry, the graves in the cemetery, the scrolls on the shelves, stopped. I want to add one thing to the Copper Scroll section that feels important at this hour of the night. The Copper Scroll's treasure list includes, at the end, a reference to a second document, a document that supposedly contains a fuller and more specific set of instructions for finding the treasure locations. This document has not been found. It may never have existed. It may have existed and been destroyed. It may have been one of the scrolls removed from Cave 12 by the ancient looters, or it may be sitting, undiscovered, in a cave that has not yet been opened. The Copper Scroll points to a guide that points to the treasure. The guide is missing. The treasure has not been found. The Copper Scroll itself is in a museum in Amman. It is a map without a destination, pointing to a manual without a copy, describing a cache without a location. And it has been in this condition for 19 centuries, and may remain in it for 19 more. It was a small community. Estimates of its size at any given time range from a few dozen to perhaps 200 people. It was strict and voluntary, and serious. People chose to come here, having passed through a period of examination and probation, having surrendered their private property to the common fund, having committed themselves to the community's calendar and rules and interpretation of Scripture. They believed the world around them was in error, and that they were not, and they were working, in the desert, to be ready for the day when the error would be corrected. In the spring of 68 AD, the routine stopped, smoke on the southern horizon. It is time to talk about the night the library went into the cliffs. Slow down here. This part needs the pace of the act itself. In the spring of 68 AD, the Roman general Vespasian, later to become emperor, moved his forces down the Jordan Valley as part of the campaign to suppress the Jewish revolt that had broken out in 66 AD. The campaign was methodical and comprehensive. The legions moved through the towns and settlements of Judea one by one. Jericho fell. The road along the Dead Sea shore was controlled. The community at Qumran could see the smoke on the horizon before the army came close. They had time. Not much, but some. And they used it. Picture the scriptorium at night, the lamps burning, the shelves around the walls. What do you take when you know you cannot take everything? What do you save when saving everything is impossible? They chose the library, not the communal vessels, not the furniture, not whatever other objects the settlement contained. The library. The wrapping took time. Each scroll, or each bundle of fragments, had to be rolled, then wrapped in a length of linen cloth, the same linen used for the burial shrouds found in the cemetery nearby. The wrapping was careful, the linen was clean. The scrolls were wrapped not hastily but with attention, the way a person wraps something they expect to be unpackaged by someone who will care about its condition. Then the jars. The settlement had produced large quantities of ceramic vessels. The pantry evidence suggests an active ceramic tradition at Qumran. The cylindrical jars are specific to the site. Their shape, their clay, their firing temperature, their lids, are a form not commonly found elsewhere. They were made to hold things. The scrolls went in, the lids went on. Some of the lids were sealed with bitumen, the natural tar that seeps from the ground around the Dead Sea. Not every jar was sealed this carefully. The evidence from different caves tells different stories about the urgency of the moment. Cave 1, the Shepherd's Cave, the first one found, is relatively organized. The jars are intact, the scrolls are wrapped, the evidence suggests deliberate care. This is the archive, the most important texts, treated with the most ceremony. Cave 4, the man-made chamber in the marl, is different. The fragments inside are not in jars. They are in heaps on the floor, layered with the debris of centuries, compressed and jumbled. This suggests either that the deposit was made in greater haste, or that the scrolls were already fragmented when they arrived, or that subsequent flooding and shifting of the soft marl terrace disturbed what had been more orderly, or all three. The replay fact for tonight's 95th minute is the act itself, the wrapping, the jars, the sealing. Hands doing this work in lamplight or starlight, carrying the jars out of the settlement and up the cliff paths to the cave mouths in the dark. The weight of a large scroll in a ceramic jar, the sound of the lid clicking into place, the short climb, the setting of the jar against the cave wall, the walk back down for the next one. They were doing an act of faith in a future they could not see. They were trusting that someone, someday, would come back and understand. They did not know the person who would come back would be a teenage shepherd who couldn't read Hebrew, throwing a stone for something to do on a slow morning. Your breath right now is slower than the breath of the people carrying jars up those paths. They were working. You are resting. The distance between those two activities is 19 centuries and a stone. The Legion came. The evidence from the excavation is a layer of ash and fire-cracked stone at Qumran, dated to around 68 AD, consistent with the destruction of the site in the course of the First Jewish-Roman War. The settlement was not burned to the ground. It was inhabited again afterward, briefly, by Roman soldiers. But the community of the jars, whatever they called themselves, did not come back. They were gone. After that, 19 centuries. Compressed here into a slow breath. Earthquakes moved through the Rift Valley. The geology that created the Dead Sea is still active, and the limestone cliffs above it crack and shift. Roof falls in some caves, deeper burial of deposits in others. Birds nested in the cave mouths. The linen wrappings on some of the scrolls show evidence of bird activity in their upper layers, a slow deterioration from the top. The Dead Sea itself shrank over the millennia, its surface dropping, the shoreline retreating from the base of the cliffs. The date palms were long gone. The settlement's walls crumbled, the inkwells filled with dust. The ceramic jars in the dark caves held their shape, held their temperature, held their contents in the specific chemical stillness that the Rift Valley's dry air creates. Nothing rotted, nothing burned. The linen stiffened, the leather darkened. The ink, made from a carbon-based compound, stayed readable on the dried animal skin it had been applied to. The clay of the jars stayed fired and hard. In Cave 1, one jar's lid was sealed so well that when Muhammad Ed-Adib's thrown stone broke it in 1947, the inside of the jar smelled, the scholars later reported, like something very old and very dry. Now, there is one more cave that deserves its own moment. And the moment is recent. In 2017, a team of archaeologists announced the discovery of a new cave, designated Cave 12, the first new cave in the Qumran area, found in more than 60 years. They were not looking for it. They found it in the course of a survey of the area, following up on some unusual disturbance in the cliff face. When they excavated the cave, they found the following: niches cut into the rock walls, where jars had clearly once stood, the jars themselves smashed. And among the debris on the floor, pickaxe heads, iron pickaxe heads, of a style consistent with antiquity. Ancient looters had been here first. At some point in the first millennium or second millennium, someone had found Cave 12, entered it, smashed the jars, and removed the contents. What was in those jars will never be known. The documents are gone, not to a museum, not to a scholarly archive, not to a climate-controlled cabinet, but into whatever happened to them, in the hands of people whose names are not recorded, in centuries whose records were not kept. The team found one thing that the ancient looters left behind: a single blank scroll, a piece of parchment, prepared and ready, never written on, the beginning of a text that was never begun. The question of which scrolls were in which caves is, in some ways, a question about the decisions made in those final days. Cave 1, the Shepherd's Cave, the first found, is relatively far from the settlement. To reach it from Qumran, you would walk along the cliff face for several hundred meters, climbing as you went. The path is not easy. The jars in Cave 1 were intact and sealed, the scrolls wrapped with care, the organization deliberate. This is the archive deposit, the texts that someone judged most important, given the best treatment, placed in the most secure location, sealed most carefully. Cave 4, the man-made chamber visible from the settlement, is close. Too close probably for a long-term hiding place if you knew the Romans were coming specifically for you. But Cave 4 has more raw material than anywhere else in the system. 15,000 fragments, 500 manuscripts. What does that combination suggest? Perhaps that Cave 4 was the library room itself, the working scriptorium storage, and when the emergency came, people simply moved the contents of the shelves into the cave, quickly, without the careful wrapping and sealing that the Cave 1 deposit received. Or perhaps it was deliberately chosen as a place to put the working library, while the archive library was stored more carefully elsewhere. The archaeology doesn't fully resolve the question. The darkness of the cave is the same darkness it has always been. The lamplight they carried is the same quality of light as the flame in any lamp in the history of flame. You know what that light looks like. What is clear is that different caves got different treatment. Some jars were sealed with bitumen, some were simply lidded, some contents were wrapped in linen, some were not. The variation reflects, almost certainly, the variation in time and resources available in the days and hours before the Romans arrived. Let me add to the reconstruction of the hiding night. The ropes. Someone would have needed ropes to carry the jars up the cliff paths to the higher caves. The jars full of scrolls were heavy. A cylindrical jar 60 centimeters tall, filled with leather rolls, might weigh 10 or 15 kilograms. Carrying that weight up a limestone cliff path in the dark required something to hold on to, something to steady yourself with. The paths exist, worn into the rock by the ta'amire over centuries of use, but they are not paths that tourists would take without a guide. The lamplight. The caves would have been completely dark. You could not see inside them without a lamp. Oil lamps, the kind that the excavation at Qumran found evidence for, are small and directional, casting a modest warm light in a tight radius. You could see what you were doing, but not far beyond it. The people carrying jars into the caves were working in a pool of lamplight, surrounded by darkness. The silence. The desert of Judea at night is one of the quieter places in the inhabited world. In 68 AD, there was no ambient noise, no distant traffic, no aircraft, no electrical hum. The sound of jar against jar, of footstep on limestone, of a lid being fitted and sealed, would have carried. The community would have worked quietly. They would have known that noise travelled in that landscape. The stars, the Dead Sea Basin, sitting at the lowest point on Earth, has some of the best astronomy conditions in the region. Very dry air, very little moisture, very little in the way of competing light. The stars at night above the Dead Sea are as dense and clear as you are likely to see in an inhabited area. The people carrying jars up the cliff paths could see by the stars, in addition to their lamps, in a way that is difficult to experience in the modern world. After the jars were set, the lids placed, the cave mouths cleared of obvious signs of disturbance, they climbed back down. What happened after that is not recorded by anyone who survived to write about it. The community's own documents stop in 68 AD. There is no letter, no journal entry, no account by a survivor. The settlement was destroyed, The evidence of fire and collapse is in the stratigraphy of the excavation, and the community was either killed, dispersed, or absorbed into the chaos of the Jewish revolt, and did not coalesce again. The silence lasted 19 centuries. Not metaphorical silence, actual silence, the silence of undisturbed limestone and dry air and sealed ceramic. Think about what happened in the world in those 19 centuries. Rome completed its empire and watched it dissolve. Christianity was born, shaped, persecuted, established, and split. Islam was founded, spread across North Africa and the Middle East and Central Asia, transformed the world around the Dead Sea into an Arabic-speaking Islamic civilization. The Crusaders arrived, built their castles on the hills above the sea, and left. The Ottoman Empire administered the region for 400 years. The British Mandate replaced it in 1920. The region was partitioned, fought over, partitioned again. 2 world wars reshaped the map of the world. In Cave 1, above the Dead Sea, the clay jars sat in the dark. The linen wrappings stiffened. The leather scrolls stayed dry. The ink, stable in the arid air, waited in its letters for eyes to read it. The lid of one jar had a hairline crack that let in just enough moisture over the centuries to begin a slow deterioration of the top layers of one scroll. The Genesis Apocryphon was in worse condition than its companions when it was found. Partly for this reason, the other jars held, and the Ta'amire grazed their goats on the hills above the caves, and their children learned the cliff paths, and the memory of whatever the caves had once held faded out of any living tradition, and the Ta'amire stopped knowing, if they had ever known, that the holes in the limestone were anything other than the occasional useful shelter in a storm. Let the weight of the jars come through the text to you, 10 or 15 kilograms, the weight of leather and wood and fired clay, carried up a cliff path in the dark by someone who had everything else to worry about, and was doing this anyway, until Muhammad Dib threw a stone. There is something I want to say about Cave 12, the one found in 2017, that I skimmed past earlier, and that deserves a fuller treatment. The archaeologists who found Cave 12 were conducting a survey of the entire cliff system above the Dead Sea in response to reports of illegal digging in the area. Looters, modern ones with metal detectors and modern tools, had been working the cliff caves, searching for scrolls that could be sold on the black market. The recent history of unauthorized excavation in the area is a troubling chapter in itself, and Cave 12's official discovery was driven partly by the need to locate and document caves before the looters reached them. When the team entered Cave 12, they found the evidence of ancient looting first. The broken jars, the smashed fragments on the floor, the niches in the wall that had clearly once held something and no longer did. And then the pickaxe heads. Iron pickaxe heads lying on the cave floor, left behind by the ancient looters who had removed the scrolls. The pickaxes are consistent with Iron Age or early Common Era technology. The looting happened a very long time ago, long enough that the looters' own tools are now archaeological evidence. The blank scroll, the piece of parchment found on the cave floor, prepared and never written on, is the most haunting object in the whole discovery. Someone had prepared a piece of skin, scraped, dried, stretched, ruled with lines for writing. They had brought it to Cave 12, presumably to write on, or perhaps it was already in the cave as part of the deposit. It was never written on. It was never read. It is a piece of potential that became, in the course of 19 centuries and one theft, permanent blankness. The beginning of a book that was never begun, the start of a sentence that stopped before the first word. The single blank scroll found in Cave 12 deserves one more sentence. A blank scroll is, by definition, a document about potential. It is the form that the word takes before the word is chosen. The community that assembled this library believed in the power of the written word with an intensity that is hard to overstate. They were, by every measure, a community of readers and writers, of people who believed that the right reading of the right text, in the right interpretation, could reveal the true meaning of history and the true shape of what was coming. And somewhere in their emergency, someone carried a blank piece of parchment to Cave 12, prepared, ready, never written on, and left it there for 19 centuries and one bad night for the people who came to steal from it. A blank page in a library otherwise full of words, the most silent thing in the most eloquent place. Some chapters of this library were stolen before anyone alive was born, and they will never be read. It is time to come down from the cliffs, back into the lit world, and follow what happened to the books after the shepherd's stone, because their journey out was almost as strange as their hiding. The shepherd found the scrolls in 1947. The scholarship took 40 more years to make them fully available. This is the part of the story that gets told with the most heat by the people who were frustrated by it, and with the most defensiveness by the people who were involved. The truth sits somewhere between, and it is more interesting than either version. When the first scrolls came to scholarly attention in 1947 and 1948, the institutions that received them assigned teams to work on them. The process of analyzing, translating, and publishing the texts from Cave 1 moved reasonably quickly. The 7 scrolls from the Shepherd's Cave had been substantially published by the early 1950s. But Cave 4, found in 1952, was a different proposition. 15,000 fragments, more than 500 manuscripts. A team of 8 scholars, assembled under DeVoe's editorship, was given responsibility for the work. 8 scholars, 15,000 fragments. The math was not in favor of speed. The team worked in the Palestine Archaeological Museum in Jerusalem, which became the Rockefeller Museum after 1966. They had the fragments spread out on tables under glass, sorted by handwriting style and material and content, reassembled into pages as far as possible, photographed. The work was painstaking, skilled, and genuinely slow, but it was also, by the 1970s and 1980s, moving more slowly than the outside world could accept, because the outside world knew that there were texts in those filing cabinets that had not been seen by anyone outside the team, that touched on questions of enormous scholarly and religious significance, and that were being held by a small group of scholars with no publication date in sight. By the 1980s, the phrase, "the scholars who had been excluded from the project used," was not a polite one. Some called it an academic scandal. The argument was not that the team was acting in bad faith. Most of the members were not, and the difficulties of the work were real, but that the arrangement giving exclusive access to so few people for so long was structurally incompatible with how scholarship is supposed to work. In 1991, the situation changed dramatically and rapidly. The Huntington Library in California held a set of photographic negatives of the Cave 4 fragments, the photographs that had been made in the 1950s and 1960s as backup copies. The library's director decided to make the photographs available to any qualified scholar who asked. Within weeks, a computer-reconstructed edition appeared from another archive. The monopoly ended not through a formal decision, but through a series of unilateral acts that the official team could not prevent. The complete official scholarly edition, the Discoveries in the Judean Desert series, eventually running to 40 volumes, edited by Emmanuel Tov, was completed in 2009. The entire process, from the Shepherd's Stone to the final volume of the official edition, took 62 years. Today, the scrolls are digitized and freely available. The Israel Antiquities Authority's Leon Levy Dead Sea Scrolls Digital Library puts high-resolution photographs of virtually every fragment online, searchable, zoomable, readable by anyone with an internet connection and enough knowledge of ancient Hebrew and Aramaic to make use of them. The library that waited 19 centuries then waited 40 more years in filing cabinets, and is now, in the most literal sense, available to anyone alive tonight who wants to look. But here is the payoff for the thread we planted near the beginning of tonight. The cobbler's shop in Bethlehem, the floor we said we were not finished with. When the 1967 Six-Day War ended with Israel in control of the West Bank, an Israeli intelligence officer and archaeologist named Yigael Yadin made a decision. Yadin was the son of Eliezer Sukenik, the Hebrew University archaeologist who had bought 3 scrolls from Kando in November 1947, 20 years earlier, in the days of the partition vote. Sukenik had died in 1953, not having seen the full scope of what his purchase had been part of. His son had spent his career as a general and an archaeologist in the new state his father had lived and died for, and in 1967, Yadin received intelligence that Kando, the Bethlehem cobbler who had been at the center of the scroll trade since 1947, had one more scroll, the longest one he had been holding for years. Yadin sent officers to Kando's home in Bethlehem. The scroll was found hidden beneath the floor tiles of the shop, in a shoebox, wrapped in cellophane, having survived through 2 more wars, 1948 and 1956, in the tiles beneath the feet of the people who came to have their shoes repaired. The temple scroll, 9 meters long, a complete, detailed blueprint for a new and purified Jerusalem temple, incorporating legal material, a calendar, and architectural specifications not found in any other surviving text, the longest of all the Dead Sea documents. It had been hidden for years beneath a cobbler's floor in Bethlehem. 2 more wars waited out in the dark under someone's feet, and it came to light the same year Israel gained control of the territories where the caves were located. Even after being found, the library kept hiding. Now let me assemble the full answer to the question we opened tonight. What was hidden above the Dead Sea? A whole world's bookshelf, every book of the Hebrew Bible but one, in copies 1,000 years older than what scholarship had. The community's own documents, a rule book, a war manual, a temple blueprint, a hymn book, a commentary on Habakkuk, a calendar. The banned books, Enoch and Jubilees and Giants, the literature that the tradition that survived had not preserved, and 1 copper scroll with 60+ hiding places for treasure that has never been found. Why did no one ever come back? In the spring of 68 AD, a Roman legion moved down the shore of the Dead Sea, and the community of the jars was erased, not necessarily to the last person, but as a community, as a continuing presence in the landscape. The hiding worked. It worked so well that the owners did not survive to undo it. The jars sat in the dark, sealed, in the dry air, while Rome fell and rose and fell again, while the caliphate spread and withdrew, while crusaders built and abandoned their fortresses on the hills above the sea, while the Ottoman centuries passed, and the British Mandate came and went, and the leather stayed, and the ink stayed, and the linen held, and the clay jars, cracked by centuries, still held their shape in the dark. The 40-year gap between discovery and full publication is worth spending more time on, because it is not as simple as either the critics or the defenders made it sound. The international team, assembled under DeVoe's editorship in 1953, was genuinely trying to do something difficult. They had tens of thousands of fragments. Many of the fragments were small, fingernail-sized, sometimes smaller. They had to be cleaned of the dust and debris that had accumulated over 19 centuries. They had to be photographed under different kinds of light to bring out the letters most clearly. They had to be matched to other fragments. This was jigsaw work, comparing the shape of each fragment's edges against other fragments, looking for physical joins that proved 2 pieces came from the same original scroll. They had to identify the handwriting style, to group fragments by the hand that wrote them, because multiple scrolls were written by the same scribe, and multiple scribes wrote on the same scroll. And all of this had to be done before you could even begin to read what the fragments said. The team had no digital tools until the final decades of the project. The early work was done with physical negatives, printed photographs, magnifying glasses, and pencil annotations. The technology of fragment matching, the techniques that allow a computer to compare the edge profiles of two fragments and identify potential joins, did not exist until the 1990s, and the teams that used those tools in the final decade of the project did in years what would have taken the original team additional decades to accomplish by hand. The frustration of the outside scholarly world was real, and some of it was justified. The exclusive access arrangement, which meant that scholars who were not on the team could not examine the fragments even if they were working on related questions, was a genuinely problematic structure. It was a structure that DeVoe had established in the early 1950s with the best intentions, and that became increasingly untenable as decades passed without a clear completion date. The scholars on the team had other commitments. They were professors with teaching loads, they were clergy with pastoral duties, they had health problems, they had family crises, they had sabbaticals and conferences, and the ordinary disruptions of academic life. The project moved when it could and stalled when it had to, and the outside world, knowing the magnitude of what was being withheld, grew impatient. The 1991 opening, the Huntington Library's decision to release its photographs, changed the situation dramatically, and in retrospect, in a way that was probably better for the scholarly world than the alternative. The fragments were released to all qualified scholars at once. The comparative work that could only happen when many specialists were working on the same material simultaneously accelerated dramatically, and the official edition continued alongside the wider scholarly publication in a way that produced a richer overall picture than the exclusive access model had been producing. Emmanuel Tov, the Israeli scholar who served as editor-in-chief of the official edition in its final decades, completed the 40-volume Discoveries in the Judean Desert series in 2009. 40 volumes. The full scholarly edition of the Dead Sea Scrolls is 40 volumes of dense academic text, comprising transcriptions, translations, notes, photographs, indices, and apparatus. It took 62 years. It is the most significant publishing project in the history of biblical studies, and it is available in university libraries everywhere, and the digital photographs are available for free on the Israel Antiquities Authority's website to anyone tonight. The library that was hidden for 19 centuries, then unavailable for 40 years, is now more accessible than any book in the ancient world has ever been. The democratization happened in the last 30 years, and it is still happening. Scholars are still identifying new fragments, still matching joins, still publishing readings of texts that have not been formally analyzed. The project is not complete. The library is still being read. Here is the Wall Street Journal advertisement again, now that you have the full story around it. June 1, 1954. 4 Dead Sea Scrolls. Biblical manuscripts dating back to at least 200 BC. Are ideal as a gift to educational or religious institution. Box 206. The 4 scrolls that Mar Samuel took from Jerusalem to the United States in 1948, tried to sell for 6 years, and finally offered through the newspaper, were the Great Isaiah Scroll, the Community Rule, the Habakkuk Commentary, and the Genesis Apocryphon, the 4 scrolls from Cave 1 that Kando and Mar Samuel had acquired in 1947. The 3 scrolls Sukenik had bought, the War Scroll, the Thanksgiving hymns, and additional War Scroll material, had been in the Hebrew University's possession since 1947 and went to the Shrine of the Book. The 4 and the 3 came together in Jerusalem, under the dome shaped like a jar lid, where they have been since. The Temple Scroll, the 9th and longest of the major Dead Sea documents, had a different journey. The story of the shoebox under the cobbler's floor in Bethlehem is true, and it is also, in its way, consistent with the pattern of this entire library. The Temple Scroll was found, like the others, in the caves above the Dead Sea in 1956. It was sold, like the others, through Kando. It was hidden, like the others, when the political situation made official channels complicated. And it was recovered, like the others, through a combination of intelligence, persistence, and the specific circumstance of the 1967 war that brought Israeli forces into the area where it was being kept. Yigael Yadin, who had bought the 4 Cave 1 scrolls from Mar Samuel in 1954 through the newspaper advertisement, recovered the temple scroll from under Kando's floor in 1967. 2 purchases, 13 years apart. The son of the man who had bought 3 scrolls from Kando in November 1947 ended up, 20 years later, acquiring 2 more troves of scroll material from the same dealer. Kando, at this point in his 70s, had spent his entire adult life at the center of the most significant manuscript discovery in modern history, without ever being a scholar. He died in 1993. His descendants still live in Bethlehem. The resolution of the master loop deserves one more pass, because the specific phrasing matters. The question we opened with tonight was a double question. What was hidden, and why did no one ever come back? The first part of the answer is the library itself, described shelf by shelf across the last several hours. The second part is the harder one, because it asks about the people rather than the books. They did not come back because they could not. The Roman military campaign of 68 AD was comprehensive and lethal, and the settlement at Qumran was in the path of it. But they had planned for this possibility. The jars were sealed. The linen was wrapped. The preparations were made by people who understood that they might not come back, and who made the preparations anyway. The hiding was not optimistic. It was realistic. A realistic act of faith, not in their own survival, but in the survival of what they valued. That is what makes the library so moving at this hour. It was not saved by people who expected to retrieve it. It was saved by people who knew they might not, and they were right. And the books came back anyway. What remains open? Their name, who exactly they were, is still argued. The copper caches, what is listed in the scroll, has never been found, and may never be. And the 2 caves, Cave 12 among them, that were emptied in antiquity, whose contents are gone, permanently, into the unnamed hands that took them. But what is true either way, true regardless of which scholarly reading you find most convincing, true without requiring any particular faith or tradition or framework, is this: real hands wrapped these books against a real catastrophe, hoping for readers they would never meet. They did not get to come back. But the books did. You do a version of this yourself, not with jars, not with limestone and linen and 19 centuries, but the instinct is the same one that stood in the lamplight in a room by the Dead Sea 2,000 years ago and chose what to keep. Think about the things you save, the photographs you've backed up twice, or 3 times, because losing them is unacceptable. The letters you've kept in a box that has moved with you through every address change. The books you would grab in a fire. The specific, particular books that are not replaceable from a bookstore because they are your copy, with your notes in the margins, from a time in your life you cannot return to. The people at Qumran had a bookshelf too. They chose what went on it, the way you choose what you save. And when they had to choose what to carry up the cliff in the dark, they chose what they believed mattered most, the texts that expressed who they were, what they thought, what they hoped, what they feared, what they intended to do when the world was finally set right. The jars are the oldest proof that saving something for later is an act of faith in later itself. You don't save things for a future you don't believe in. You don't wrap scrolls in linen and seal the lid with bitumen if you think nobody is ever coming back to read them. The sealing is an argument made in clay and linen, in the dark, against the darkness. Whoever you are, someone 2,000 years ago gambled that a stranger like you would eventually be kind to what they loved. They were right. The scrolls are on 1 million glowing screens tonight, readable for free, by anyone, including you, including right now. The bet paid off, the faith was justified, and somewhere in the filing cabinets of the academic world, somewhere in the fragments still being processed, still being matched to their neighboring pieces, still being read for the first time, there may be more. The Bedouin who found Cave 4 took fragments home with them, fragments that made their way through the market in pieces, some of which have turned up in collections around the world, and some of which have not. The story of the library is not fully told. It is still in the process of being returned. That is worth something at this hour. The idea that the most significant manuscript discovery in modern history is still coming in, still arriving, still being read for the first time by people who will spend their careers on these scraps of dark leather, in labs in Jerusalem and Oxford and New York, under precise lights with precise instruments, turning fragments over in cotton-gloved hands, and finding, in the ink on the back of a piece the size of a playing card, a sentence that no one alive has ever read before. Before you go further into the night, a very small ask. If this is the kind of evening you come here for, the slow ones, the ones that go all the way into the dark, a quiet tap-on like helps other quiet ones find their way here. And the comment below is open. Where in the world are you tonight, and what would you save? I'll read them in the morning. And if you want to keep climbing these caves, if you want to be here for the Enoch nights, the Giant's night, the Copper Scroll deep dive when I do it properly, the subscribe button is right there, completely optional. Keeping the library company tonight is already more than enough. Now, the cliffs above the Dead Sea are dark tonight. They are always dark at this hour. There are no lights on that shore, no settlements close enough to cast a glow on the limestone. The lowest place on earth holds its darkness completely. The cave mouths are just slightly darker than the rock around them, barely visible, the shape of small absences in the cliff face. The jars are long empty. Some of them are in museums. The Israel Museum in Jerusalem holds the original Cave 1 jars in a climate-controlled case beside a facsimile of the Great Isaiah scroll, unrolled in a long, slow curve under a circular light. Some of the jars crumbled when they were found, and the fragments of fired clay are in archive boxes. The clay settled 19 centuries ago and has not moved since. The scrolls are safe now, in their climate-controlled rooms, under their precise lights, in their acid-free housings, on their millions of glowing screens. The library that was hidden is found. The books that were sealed are open. The text that no living person had read for 19 centuries has been read now by more people than the community that wrote it could have imagined existed. Remember that sound, pottery, shattering in the dark, the teenager throwing the stone, the wrong sound coming back out of the cliff, the jars on the floor in the lamplight. You carry a small version of the library with you at all times. Not literally, but the instinct, the need to preserve, to protect, to save the things that express who you are, against the possibility that the context that gave them meaning will not last. That instinct is as human as anything in this story. The people at Qumran were not extraordinary in their desire to protect what they valued. They were extraordinary only in the specific things they valued, and in the specific quality of their execution, and in the accidents of geology and climate, and one bored teenager that allowed the execution to work. What would you wrap in linen tonight, if you had to? What would you carry up a cliff path in the dark, in the last hours before something irreplaceable was destroyed? The community at Qumran chose their answer and put it in jars. Their answer was the words. The careful copies of the careful copies, corrected and repaired and corrected again. The rulebook, the hymns, the war plans and the dream of the right temple and the calendar that kept the right time, the banned books they loved. And whatever was on the copper scroll, whether real treasure or remembered treasure or imagined treasure, they chose to write it in metal, in permanent metal, because some things should not be made of something that can rot. There is a kind of faith in that act that does not require any particular theology to recognize. You have to believe in later to save something for later. You have to believe that there will be hands that want to receive what you are giving, that the future will be curious rather than indifferent, that the stranger who finds the jar will be kind to what's inside it rather than frightened or bored. The sealing of the jar is an argument for the value of the future. And the future was kind. The scholarship has been passionate and contentious, and occasionally petty, and occasionally revelatory. But underneath all of it, there is a consistent recognition that something enormously precious came out of those caves, and that it deserves the best attention human beings can give it. The 40-year delay in publication was frustrating, but the people responsible for it were not negligent. They were overwhelmed, and the technology did not exist yet to help them, and they kept working anyway. The library eventually arrived. It took 62 years from the Shepherd's Stone to the last volume of the official edition, but it arrived, and it is freely available now, tonight, to anyone who wants to read it. Whoever sealed those jars in 68 AD would not have predicted the internet. They would not have predicted high-resolution digital photography, or computer algorithms that match fragment edges, or climate-controlled archive rooms with precise humidity control. They would not have predicted that 1 million screens in 1 million rooms in countries they had never heard of would carry the text of the great Isaiah scroll at 3 a.m. to readers who are falling asleep listening to someone talk about the night the library went into the cliffs. They sealed the jars anyway. They trusted the future anyway. They climbed down from the cave in the dark and went back to whatever came next, and they were right to do it. The books found their readers. The readers found the books. The distance between them was 19 centuries and one bored shepherd with a stone, and it was enough. There is a fact about the Dead Sea Scrolls that I have been saving for this final movement of the night, because it belongs here rather than in the analytical sections. Of the roughly 900 manuscripts represented in the caves, a significant portion are not in the published editions yet. They are known. Fragments have been photographed, scholars have noted their existence, but they have not been fully transcribed, translated, and published. The project is not done. The library is still coming in. Sometime in the next decade, perhaps the next several decades, a scholar in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv or Oxford will identify a join between two fragments that have been sitting in separate archive boxes for 70 years, and they will read a sentence that no living person has ever read, and they will understand something about the Second Temple period that had been unclear before that moment. Let me tell you what the cliffs look like right now, if you could see them. The limestone is grey-white in the moonlight, if there is a moon tonight above the Dead Sea. The cave mouths are darker patches in the rock face, irregular, some barely visible, some with the slight overhang that makes them look like closed eyes. The path that the Ta'amire have used for generations to move between the cliff levels is visible as a slight wearing of the rock surface, barely distinguishable from the surrounding terrain. The salt flat of the Dead Sea below reflects whatever light there is, pale and flat and completely still, the water absolutely calm at this hour, the specific calm of the world's saltiest body of water at 3 a.m. Cave 1 is up there, Cave 4 is there, in the marl, almost at terrace level, close enough to the ruins that you could almost reach it from the settlement without really climbing. Cave 3 is further north, holding nothing now except the place where the copper scroll was. Cave 12 is there too, ancient, looted and empty, with the blank scroll and the pickaxe heads gone to the museum, and the niches that once held jars holding only the memory of their shape. The fragments are in Jerusalem, in acid-free housing in precise humidity. The great Isaiah scroll is in its curve under its dome. The copper scroll is in Amman. The temple scroll is behind glass in the shrine of the book, and the digitized versions of all of them are on servers somewhere in the world, returning results to search queries at this exact moment. being read by scholars in time zones that the community at Qumran could not have conceived of, in languages the teacher of righteousness never heard. The library is out, the library is everywhere. The jar is long broken and the linen long settled, and the dark of the cave is just a dark cave now, empty, the smell of something old and dry long since aired away. The books found their readers. The work is done. You are living in the period when this is still happening. The greatest manuscript discovery of the modern world is still being made. They waited. The books waited. The caves waited. The limestone waited. The dry Rift Valley air held the leather and the ink and the linen across 19 centuries of everything that happened in the world above. And when the moment came, a stone and a bored boy and the right kind of sound were enough. Whatever is still hidden in those cliffs has waited this long. It can wait until morning. The caves can wait until morning. The world can wait until morning. For now, you can rest.